wanted to do a little analysis because there's this ongoing kind of online debate between Chicago gangs and LA gangs. And this is kind of coming up lately because of this killing in LA of this rapper, and then King Yella, who's from Chicago, talking about LA, kind of dissing them the way they operate. So I'm going to give my analysis. Now, I grew up in the 70s. I was born in the early 70s. Um, my experience with gangs, growing up around them in Los Angeles County, San Gabriel Valley to be exact, is late 70s all the way through the 90s. And the thing is that I think a lot of people don't understand LA, how it operates. People from the East Coast, Midwest, is a whole different animal. Because I lived in New York. I lived in New York for a year and a half. Lived in Miami for about half a year. And LA gang culture, I like the way someone put it. They said Chicago gangs is like a religion and LA gangs is like a lifestyle. And when you look at LA gang culture, it's not all about what you see on TV, killings, drive-bys. Growing up in that culture and around that culture and kind of running in that culture for a few years, it was far more than just, oh, you go fight, you go, get the enemy. It was more about a lifestyle, how you lived your life, waking up every day, planning out what you're going to do in terms of hanging out with the homeboys. A lot of times your mind is on girls. Let's go. Can we go hit this girl up and go hang out with her? This is before the days of the internet and social media, before the cell phone. So gangs at that time would be posted up outside. It would hang out in their neighborhood. And the thing, if you were the Cholo gangs would listen to oldies, and then NWA was starting to come up in like '87, and so but before that, the black gangs would listen probably to hip hop and oldies too. They would listen to oldies too. And part of LA gang culture was cruising. That was big in Whittier Boulevard in the '70s, and then by the early '80s they had stopped that due to a lot of the gang fights. But you still had cruising on Hollywood Boulevard. You still had cruising in Laurel Canyon and San Fernando Valley. Going to the skating rinks was a big thing. I remember going to the skating rinks and, people throwing, as they're skating, throwing up the gang signs, Zapp and Roger playing on the speaker. So gang culture in LA isn't just about, oh, let's go kill somebody. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the times it's about avoiding conflict, right? It's about staying in your neighborhood, hanging out, trying to get with the girls. And even oftentimes when crossing boundaries in another neighborhood, because you may have friends there, you may have a girlfriend there, a girl you're visiting, when your entrance in and you're coming back out of that neighborhood, you're not looking for conflict, you're trying to avoid it. So I remember me and my friends, as we're going back home, we're cognizant of cars that are driving by. And even if we were in residential streets and a car would drive by, we would go behind the tree or the bushes. Again, a lot of it is avoiding conflict, right? And only a few members of each gang, depending on how big the gang was, were actual people that put in work in terms of the drive-by, right? Only a few. So it's not like every gang member was putting in work and doing this. They do other things. So that's one thing to dispel the myth that gangbanging in LA was all about going out and doing drive-bys and fighting. No, a lot of it was trying to avoid conflict and just hang out with the homies, hit up a girl, barbecues, house, ditching parties when you were younger, throwing house parties, going to the skating rinks, roller rinks. That was a lot of the gang. That's a lot of the gangbang culture in LA. It's a lifestyle. Okay, so I'm not from Chicago. Yep. Hey, Modin, good to see you, man. Good to see you, brother. Salute, salute. So that's how gangs in LA have been. You know, what started up the ante was the introduction of crack in LA. That kind of then made the drive-by more popular, right? It got more violent in the early, the around the mid '80s, all the way through the probably up to the mid '90s. It got real violent. The gangbang in LA was all about that, hanging out. I remember going to Skate Junction in West Covina. That was our thing. Or, like I said, going to the beach, barbecues. A lot of times trying to avoid conflict. Now, I'm not from Chicago, but the impression I have, and I know this hasn't always been true because I watch videos on Chicago gang history, and I kind of like their style. They wear the sweaters with the colors. It was kind of a cool style, like, a style that, like the Sharks and that movie West Side Story. But now the impression I get of Chicago with the drill music is that it's all about the violence. It's all about the drive-by and the shooting. And I'm not sure if that's how it all is or if that's the impression that we're getting. But that's not LA gang culture. It never has been all about that. That would happen. And LA was known for that. But that wasn't all about what LA gangs were all about. There was a whole culture to it as a lifestyle, the way you dressed. I remember having knee-high socks. Now, I ran with what's traditionally known as a black gang, but we were mixed, right? We were mixed. And the knee-high socks, the overalls with the Nike Cortez and the hat, and we'd go to, I forgot what that place is called in El Monte, that used to sell all the like the house shoes and the Cascade jackets. We'd go there, Old Valley Boulevard in El Monte. But anyways, so my impression of Chicago gangs is that that's what it's all about. The violence, the drive-by. That's not what LA gangs is all about. So this whole idea about we're harder because, look, we're in the news killing people, like that's not the barometer of being, I guess, an OG. It's not the barometer of being, well, we're the hardest because we're clapping people up more. But I know it wasn't always like that. In fact, LA, just like Chicago, was way worse in the 80s and 90s than it is now. Even though Chicago was in the newspapers, it was way worse in the 80s with them because that's just how it was in America. Because you had in LA gangs are different now because of the RICO statutes, gentrification. Okay, so the gangs, like in my neighborhood where my mom lives, you would see homeboys posted up all the time. But now you don't see it as much because, like I said, people now, there's a lot of reasons to stay inside. There's a lot of reasons to stay indoors now. We didn't have all the social media back then. So the thing you look forward to each day was, what are the homies doing? Let's go up the street. I remember waking up, ironing my clothes, listening to oldies or hip hop, and getting ready and just let's see what we can do today. And 9 times out of 10, it wasn't let's go fight somebody. 9 times out of 10, it was avoiding that. It was avoiding that. Okay. Now in Chicago, when we talk about who's the original gangs, LA or Chicago, well, we go a little farther back and let's talk about New York. There were gangs in New York in the mid 1800s. So by definition, they're the original. Yeah, exactly, Modin. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. See, our generation, Generation X, we kind of created this, what we have now, which is people realize I'm in the generation of a latchkey kid. My mom was at work. I'd go home after school and I had the house to myself. But now people are definitely, now they can have cameras at their house. They can check on their kids more often. Absolute. People taking care of their kids better. Kids are smarter. They're, but see, this like in New York, you had the Dead Rabbits and all. Like you've seen the movie Gangs in New York. Well, that was a Hollywood version of the gangs in New York in the 1800s. And then, as railroads started being built to the west, these New Yorkers started moving to Chicago, and you had a lot of European American street gangs start in Chicago in, I think, the 20s. You know, now Chicano gangs in LA have at least been around since the 20s. So the Latino gangs in LA are older than the Latino gangs in Chicago. And there's even, I heard, Dogtown or something like that. Dogtown in LA is even to the early 1900s was started out as kind of a like Irish thing. So the Latino gangs in LA are definitely older than Latino gangs in Chicago because Latinos have been here longer. Just geographics, right? It's easier to come over from Mexico and settle in California than it is to go all the way up to Illinois. And then as far as like the black gangs in Chicago, like Vice Lords, Disciples, I think they started a little bit before the Crips and Bloods. But there were black gangs before the Crips and Bloods in LA, Businessmen, Slossons. Now, the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, both cities are OG because both cities have their own unique gang culture. And when you go to other cities, 9 times out of 10, those cities are either emulating LA or Chicago. Okay. Now, Chicago has caught up to LA in terms of influence when it comes to the gang culture because the movie Colors that came out in 1988, that was a game changer in terms of the reputation of LA gangs among the nation. But by that time, LA gangs were already taking and setting up cliques all over the country. Seattle, Washington, Tacoma, Washington, Omaha, Nebraska. When I took the Greyhound to New York, I ran into Bloods in Omaha, Nebraska at a McDonald's. 3 of them were white, one black guy, and the black guy was from San Diego who was starting a clique over there. Kansas City, St. Louis. When I went to the military and I flew into St. Louis to go to my base in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, a Crip hit me up. He was from St. Louis. He was cleaning rolling 60s. He had gold teeth. He was a Crip, cool guy. He just asked me where I was from. I told him. By that time, like I said, I had ran with a clique for a few years, and that clique doesn't even exist anymore. It was a small clique we just started. But by the time I moved to Miami and New York and all that, there was no point in me doing that anymore because I'm over there. But I still dressed the part. I had the style because I liked the way that looked. And people in Miami looked at me as unique in the way I dressed. But in Miami, when I was there, they had a small gang culture there, not big, but it was usually the Chicago influence. You had Latin Kings, you had, I think that was the one that I remember being there. And I think you had some Disciples. And then when I moved to New York, the gangs in New York pretty much died out by 1980 because of hip hop. But when I lived in New York, I actually met some Latin Kings that were from New York. This is 1992, 93. Real cool guys, hung out with them. I remember one even wanted me to be one. I said, no. He says, I'll get you the Latin King Bible, get you beads. I'm like, no. They're really cool guys. But little did I know that LA gangs were about to hit there because I always looked at New York as a separate thing. They weren't about that gang stuff. They even kind of would mock it in rap videos, rap songs. And now you have a lot of LA gang influence in New York. A little bit of Chicago, but mostly LA, which talks about influence because of hip hop blowing up in the West Coast in the mid and late 80s, and then all the way through the 90s. And the movies like Colors, Men's Society, Boys in the Hood, LA gangs became super influential all over the world, not just America, but all over the world. And a lot of it it's not the violence necessarily that people are attracted to. It was the style, the Dickies, the Converse, the Nike Cortez, the Pendletons, that type of style. I mean, even in Japan, there's a cholo culture there. And that's another aspect of LA gang culture, the lowriders. The lowriders. The lowriders. And that's LA gang culture, both Chicano and Black. Or Latino. Let's just make it Latino because, So the LA gang culture, to me, when I look at it comparing it to the Chicago gang culture, it's a lifestyle. And I love the way someone said it. Chicago gang culture is a religion. They're very structured and organized, like defined leadership and hierarchy. Where in LA gangs, I like what T. Rogers says. T. Rogers was a Blackstone Ranger from Chicago who moved to LA, I believe in the early 70s or late 60s. And he started the Black P. Stone Bloods. And there was a magazine article in one of the big magazines. It might have been Time. It might have been People magazine. And T. Rogers said it himself. LA is not like Chicago. You can't compare. LA is literally the Wild West. He said the bosses of all bosses will not survive in LA. So unlike Chicago or New York, not one guy can come over here and rule the roost. It is the Wild West. The gangs here are not, well, in prison it's different, obviously, right, with organizations, but the gangs out here are more loosely knit. It's more of an equality. Yeah, you have the OGs, you have the veteranos, but it's not like one guy in a structured leadership, and they have, Bibles like kind of the Latin Kings and all that stuff. So those are the differences. Where you'll go to Chicago gangs, they're really structured and the bylaws and these literatures and all this stuff. LA gangs is more of a lifestyle, the way you live your life every day. And it's not about all this like hierarchy. Because you hear all the time in LA gangs, the youngsters, they'll pop off on the older ones because these young guys are hungry. These young guys are hungry. So I remember the thing about the innocent, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, I remember there was an honor among the gang members because they wouldn't mess with people that were innocent. They wouldn't mess with civilians 9 times out of 10. That didn't start happening a lot till the mid 80s. And again, it was because of the crack epidemic upped the game. It increased the ability for people not to feel anything going to do a drive-by and then hitting someone innocent. But now Chicago has been in the news for the last 10 years. And so they have built their reputation nationally through a lot of the stuff, a lot of the violence, whereas most of the big cities up until the last couple of years were decreasing in violence. In fact, in 1992, there were 5,600 and some odd homicides in LA County. And in 2017, there was like 178. Shows you how things have changed, but now it's increasing again. But where most of the country was decreasing in violence, Chicago, even though it was decreasing, was above. And that's why Chicago stood out over the last 10 years. And so now in the drill music, now Chicago's time to shine, right? So to speak. So now there's this debate. Who's the OG? Who's the most influential? Again, it's different. They're different. And the rest of the country, if you go to a city, they're either going to have a Chicago gang influence or an LA gang influence. So they are the two homelands. They have their unique culture. Because here in LA, you don't have Chicago gang culture in terms of, you don't have it. Chicago, you don't. What I hear, you have it in the suburbs in Illinois, but not in the city. You don't have LA gang culture because both cities have deep roots in history in their gang culture. LA gang culture has changed in the way, because of the RICO statutes. You don't see guys posting up as much. You don't see guys, flaming up if you're a blood and dressing the way they did in the 90s and 80s and 70s because you're going to be a target. by the police. And there's the one thing about LA that's deceiving too. And I've seen this when I lived in New York. I've taken the Greyhound cross country several times, and I've seen Indianapolis, I've seen Chicago. Those cities are older, they're more run down, they look more ghetto. If you come to LA, very few parts of Los Angeles, and this is for the outsiders to understand, very few parts of Los Angeles look ghetto. Why? Because it's a newer city. LA's built spread out, not up. Okay? Because of earthquakes. But people from out of town are understanding. Don't get deceived by LA, because it could look like palm trees and sunny and nice. And then you're in the ghetto, so to speak. You're in a bad neighborhood. And it's so true. It's very true. Because you go to some parts of the west side of the 110 freeway in South Central, it looks like a suburb. But you can get caught up super easy. You can get caught up super easy. La Puente, California, where I grew up. There's some areas that do look run down, but most of it looks blue collar. People own a lot of homeowners there, but it's been known. And the San Gabriel Valley is being one of the hot spots. And that's the difference between Chicago and a lot of the cities back east. And the cities back east is very run down. They look ghetto. But in LA, most places don't. Even people, when you see these LA gang vlogs, you'll see comments, oh, that looks like a nice neighborhood. And that's the key word, looks. And this is why people that come from out of town don't sleep in the areas you go to. Don't think because it looks nice, you can't get dealt with, because you can. You got to be careful wherever you go. Wherever you go. But when I lived back east in the early 90s, people knew about LA. And this was just after the LA riots, and people were like, man, LA plays for keeps. LA had a reputation. I'm not saying that's good, because we don't want that anymore, right? But now Chicago has the rep in the last 10 years because of what's in the news, because as all the other cities in the country were decreasing in violence, Chicago was having far more than the other cities who had decreased. The national trend from the mid-90s all the way up until a couple years ago was downward. So those are the things, Chicago, LA. Who's the OG? Who's the most influential? They're both OG in their own respects, because they both have their unique gang culture. Now, people from Chicago point out, oh, well, you guys have the Black P Stones, and they start in Chicago. Yeah, it's one gang out of thousands, man. See, LA's not like Chicago, where you have, like, say, one gang, like, say, the Latin Kings, they have this huge influence over the city. It's not like that in LA. LA's so huge and vast. Yeah, there's big gangs here, but not one gang has overriding influence over a big part of the city. It's not like that in LA. So the Black P Stones are big in the jungles. But again, LA's so spread out. Like T. Rogers said, the boss of all bosses wouldn't be able to run LA. It's the Wild West out here. And then you have Latin Kings in Pasadena, California, but they're not the same as the ones in Chicago, and they're a small neighborhood. So a lot of hate towards LA. Why? And no disrespect to Chicago, because they got their own unique culture, their own thing, but a lot of hate towards LA because, listen, the LA culture, period, the lowriders, the hip hop, Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, NWA, the way LA dresses, the Dickies, the Pendletons, and all that, and even the lowrider bikes. People love it. And when you're loved, there's going to be people jealous and hateful of you. Because no disrespect to Chicago, the drill music and all that stuff, I mean, that's cool, but it's not nearly as influential as LA and the West Coast hip hop and Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg. That thing is still living on today. It's still living on today. This is why you can go on the internet and what will people like Vlad TV talk about? The West Coast, East Coast rivalry. And people all around the country love LA culture, LA urban culture. Because it's not all about the violence. It's the lifestyle, the way you dress, the cruising, the low riding, the going to the beaches, having a barbecue. I mean, anybody that lives in the San Gabriel Valley knows Leg Lake. Leg Lake barbecues on Easter, carne asada, all that. But a lot of it is because they wish they all could be California. And I understand that because you have the backdrop of beaches and palm trees and sunny skies here to go along with the culture that is unique. It looks different than the rest of the country. And that's why I believe LA is more influential. Now, I do watch older videos about Chicago history, gang history, and I think it's cool. I like the whole sweaters thing is really cool. The way they would do their tags on the wall with all their symbols, because you don't see that in LA. LA is just the tagging with the writing. So the Chicago graffiti is top notch. No doubt on that. Their graffiti, their gang graffiti is top notch. It's artistic. And I'm not promoting gangs. I'm just telling you how I see it, comparing the cultures. And the sweaters and all that stuff, that looks cool. But now, like when you look at it, it just looks like, when I look at the Chicago gangs and they do their videos, I don't see nothing unique about it. I just see it's like more violence, like more like promoting violence and, we're going to go do this, we're going to do that. To me, that's not gang culture, because gang culture was supposed to be a brotherhood, sisterhood. Originally, that was the intent. And that's how Chicago gangs were, because I'm learning about the history. I'm seeing how these gangs started. They started off as social clubs, brotherhoods. They'd have their colors, the sweaters, and it's pretty cool stuff. So I respect the Chicago culture. It's unique, but I'm just saying the facts that as far as influence goes, I mean, in the gang world, it's LA. Just like New York has the hip hop influence and always will. LA has the gang influence and always will. There's nothing to take away from Chicago because they're OGs at this too. It's just, you can't really compare. They're two different animals, Chicago and LA. And because you have more violence, doesn't really mean anything, because that's not really what gangs were intended to be all about. So to me, it's the culture, the value of the culture. Now, gangs, I tell people stay away because there's no good result that comes out of it. But I'm just telling you how I saw it when I was growing up in it. And then how it did change into more of a violent thing as time went on. Because when I grew up, I felt safe walking and seeing 10 cholos coming my way, because they wouldn't mess with civilians. At that time, I was a civilian. They wouldn't mess with civilians. They weren't about that. They weren't looking for a fight all the time. I never felt fear walking around a gang member back in those days, in the late 70s through the mid 80s. It wasn't until I went to junior high, and then that's where, So, but that's how it is, Chicago versus LA. They're both OG, but I think LA has more of the influence because of where we're at and the uniqueness of the culture. Because when you look at the Chicago culture, the way they dress now, it's just like anybody else dresses, right? It's not really unique. I know they have the left-right thing, but LA has a whole stilo, and it stands out, and it's known. and people emulate it. I mean, you go to Japan, they have that cholo culture in Japan. So anyways, that's my thoughts on Chicago versus LA. They're both OG. It's fascinating learning about Chicago gang history. I think the sweaters and their tags are pretty cool. I think those are like top notch. But I know their culture has changed too, just like LA's culture. But anyway, salute. Have a great Saturday.